Have the guests of honor come to the tables up here in addition to the guest speakers we have for tonight. They'll find them. They can read.
I'm not any of them.
Nah, you're around here someplace, Bill. Hey, this is Oregon.
Oh, geez, you put me next to Penley.
We all have a cross to bear, Bill. Ed?
They put the two Johns together.
Take it easy, kid.
Oh, two holders. Okay, I can recognize. I put my glasses on to see where
Is that right?
I'm sure you.
Only following instructions.
Following instructions, Ed. When all else fails,
Is that
follow
right?
instructions.
I'll leave. Just about by speed.
Yeah, looks like we're all here but Lee, huh? Well, I'd like to welcome everybody to this festive occasion. My name is Dick Capiola. I'm the manager of the Test Engineering Department, and which is the department Ed is going to be working for the next, 2 days, Ed? And then off to greener pastures.
13 hours.
I'd like to start off by introducing our guests of honor. I'd like to start with the better half of this combination here, Marilyn Zweiback. Ed's daughter, Nancy. Son, David. And last but not least, Old Easy. No pun intended, Ed. Well, we kind of set a tradition a few retirements ago in the Test Engineering Department, and that who's ever assigned to organize these things goes out and finds the entry employment picture of the person who's retiring and present it to him as part of these festivities. With Ed, we had a bit of a problem. And the best we could do, if I can get this thing done, was probably a midlife picture of Ed. I don't know, you guys can help me with this, John. Short badge, this is probably the 60s, huh?
Yeah,
That kind
that's-
of short badge?
He never
late
had hair?
60s.
Well, wait a minute. Now, you know, we weren't satisfied with this, and, you know, us testers are pretty dedicated people in getting the real facts on everything. So we did some research, and we used the latest technology, image processing, digital enhancement. I think the best information we received was from the LAPD, and we were able, through the deft hand of Tom Phelps, our resident artist, to construct how Ed really looked when he started working at Douglas. Is that good, Ed?
Generous. Generous.
That's pretty suave. Well, I'd like to touch on a few brief highlights of Ed's career. And after reviewing the list of distinguished speakers we have today, I decided not to spend a lot of time on that because I'm sure we're going to hear a lot of details I wouldn't be able to capture from this august body to my left. So I'll just briefly touch on some of the highlights. Ed began his career at Douglas in 1954, the August of '54. And if I can find it here, it all started with a letter from a gentleman that some of these people to my left might be familiar with. I'll read it to you. May 19th, 1954, addressed to Mr. Edgar L. Zweiback, some address in L.A. Dear Mr. Zweiback, as a result of your recent discussions with Mr. J.B. Healy of the Power Plant Mechanical Section, we are looking forward to your rejoining our organization in the capacity outlined below. I should say that Ed, in his college years, did spend some summer work time at Douglas. I believe it was refurbishing C-47s, Ed. And as a result of his great performance at bucking rivets or whatever he was doing, they decided to hire him into the power plant section. Anyway, to go on, the position will be that of flight test analyst at $2.10 per hour, which amount to $432 per month on the basis of a 45-hour work week, which we are now working. As mutually agreed, it states, upon, we will anticipate you being able to start your employment with us August the 2nd of '54. Sincerely yours, W.H.P. Drummond, Chief Engineer, Testing Division. I notice this is unsigned, Ed. Have you ever received a paycheck from the Douglas Aircraft Company? You can keep that for your mementos.
Thank you.
Anyway, that started it all with Ed at Douglas, and he's essentially spent his entire career associated with the testing business. His early career was, as that memo stated, a flight test analyst. Worked for Verlin Mars, one of our more infamous characters we've had in the organization, and did a lot of the early work, participated in a lot of early work on some of our fighter planes of that era. He went on, and probably his longest duration in any single job, and a very important one, it turned out, was moving into the area of noise and flyover noise testing in the business. This particular area became very important in the early 60s and through on out to today due to the noise situation we find ourselves in around airports. Ed was very instrumental in a lot of development of a lot of technology in the field of acoustic testing, instrumentation, methods, and procedures. He then spent some time as a technical advisor to the organization and has essentially continued in that capacity to the present, where he is the branch manager, or soon be was the branch manager of the Advanced Test Technology Group in test engineering. Along with that, Ed has published many papers that have been published in various journals associated with that particular technology. He is a registered professional engineer, mechanical engineer with the state of California, an associate fellow of the AIAA, and some of his outside activities included leadership roles in the Boy Scouts of America. So with that, Ed, I think I'm going to turn some other descriptive material about you over to our distinguished speakers. And I'd like to start with a good friend of a lot of us and the former director of what was called Flight and Lab Development at the time, retired 4 years, I believe, John. John Hand.
Thanks, Cappy. Thank you. Well, my recollections of Ed go back quite a ways. I'm rather vague when he was up at Edwards, but I have some vivid recollections of when he was one of a tribe of 3 bachelors back at Patuxent. We had quite a gang of people back there. And it got a little dull occasionally, but we could always rely upon the bachelors to liven things up. And there's one other of the 3 that's here tonight, that's Bud Harris and Marilyn, whom he met back there at that time, which broke up the bachelor establishment. But their exploits were renowned amongst not only the Douglas crew, but the Navy as well. But I wondered if anyone here beside Bud knew how it came about that he'd started wearing a beard, which you've seen him in off and on now and then. He got a very bad cold somewhere in the wasteland of the dark winters back there, and decided after lying in bed for a couple of days that he really needed some nourishment. So he boiled up a pot of soup. And I don't, to this day, know how he managed to do it, but he managed to spill the soup, and he got it on his face, on his chin in particular, burned himself so badly he couldn't shave. And that's when he started wearing beards. I also remember his early courtship of Marilyn. Used to be up at Edwards, and we'd come home on the weekends, and he cozened me into driving across Angeles Crest Highway and dropping him off in Alhambra, I think it was, where South Pasadena, right. Marilyn was teaching at that time, as I remember, and was one busy person, and I'm not sure how the two of them ever quite managed to make it happen, but they did. Anyway, it's been a long and prestigious career for Ed. I think those of you who have known him, and I think all of you have enjoyed his sense of humor. He spurred my wife, Maggie, into embarrassing herself one time when he was sitting beside her at one of the more pompous rollout ceremonies. And they were fairly near the front. Ed kept making rude comments along the way, and he finally broke her up, which resulted in several of the heads in the front row turning around to see what the hell a disturbance was. Anyway, those of you who've known him as well as I have certainly recognize that the one key word to Ed is integrity, professional and personal both. And I've always respected him for that. We've had any number of go-rounds, which we both enjoyed, I think. At least I certainly did, and I think Ed did too, because he seemed to provoke them frequently. But we always came out smiling. And I think it's been a distinguished career, Ed. My congratulations on your having graduated.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John. Our next speaker is a former boss of Ed's and who moved on to other areas in the company and then subsequently retired as the director of ET&IS, most recently, John Strom.
Well, I did, I guess, have Ed work for me. I really wasn't sure whether I was working for him or he was working for me.
I gave you the benefit of the doubt, John.
Thank you. If you know Ed, why, he's a real documenter. He'll document everything. There was no question about whether I knew what was going on, as he let me know in all sorts of ways. So, Ed, I commend you on keeping me up to date. There's a couple of stories. You all know that Ed is looked on at the Douglas Company, I guess, probably nationally and internationally as a key figure in flyover noise testing. And he spent a great deal of time doing that. Now, he had a lot of other interests with the company that sort of paled into insignificance. In his earlier days, he worked on most of the Navy airplanes that came out of El Segundo, and he worked on all of the commercial airplanes that came out of Santa Monica and Long Beach. He even worked on the C-124. I was amazed to find that out, looking at some of his reports. So he's had quite a broad background and a real diverse interests within the company and within the technical world. He also was very interested in the outside world around him. There's a couple of examples I could cite. One of them was in 1976 when he wrote Briz a letter telling him that we ought to let bicycles into the plant. And I think that the reason why that came about really was that Ed took up, in the gas rationing days, took up riding his bicycle to work, and he found out that he couldn't get it any further than the gate. He was locked out, where if he drove his car, he could drive into the plant, out to Building 41. So he wrote this neat memo to Briz, telling him all of the great advantages of bicycles in the plant. Air pollution, efficiency. You probably remember more of those than I do, but that prompted some kind of a big decision from our leaders. It turns out that they didn't think that was such a good idea because bicycles operating in the plant were dangerous, more dangerous than four-wheeled vehicles. So it turns out that bureaucracy finally won out and bicycles were outlawed. But good try, Ed. Another case in the Boy Scouts. Ed was a Boy Scout leader, and he went to summer camp, I guess, probably on several occasions, but I happened to see a letter that he got back from a fellow named John Hancock. And that has always stuck in my mind, that Ed's really traveling in high upper echelons, I guess I'd say. And if you keep that up, Ed, I'm sure you're going to last out retirement in great shape. Congratulations.
Thanks, Don.
Our next speaker is also a former director in flight test engineering. He defected. He's now working in training systems and services. Bill DeChamp.
Oh, I got pages here.
How many rights are?
2 minutes, somebody said?
2 minutes.
You know, in this business, in any big business, you judge people from a process which is very strange. You meet many people, you go to many meetings, you have short encounters with them. They say one word or another. Each input is put into your data bank, and eventually you get a perspective of this person. That's kind of the way we have to operate, because we don't, with the way we run, we don't have time for any in-depth discussions. Well, with Ed, it's different. You never got a quick answer out of Ed. There was no offhand remarks. In fact, each encounter was kind of a classroom lecture where you were the freshman and he was the professor, and the stories were all put together. The quadratic equations were solved, objective reasoning pursued, and after hours and hours, he finally had you going his way. That's the way he works. He had the, and he probably still has, the uncanny ability of reducing any question to mathematical terms. And to back him up on that, he always had, he started off, hell, I knew him when he had a slide rule. Then he moved into a calculator and eventually into the computer. And there was a time, too, when he even tried to introduce artificial intelligence into the computer, but he wiped that out because it was against his argument most of the time. So despite this difference of how you obtained a calibration of Ed compared to normal people, you finally, your data bank got it all together, and you had to conclude that, one, when you ask him a question, be prepared for a college-level course, and bring your lunch. Two, he utilized mathematical devices as a security blanket, and without a mainframe computer at home, his retirement is going to be unsuccessful. Now, on a more serious note, what did Ed contribute to the industry we're in? Back years ago, when I started testing jets, one of the primary things we tested, and I guess George Mabry is here, he'll know that, was the performance of an airplane in an airport environment. the takeoff, the transition, the initial climb. These were very important parameters and could make or break an aircraft. And at that time, we were dealing with anemic engines and weak brakes and unsophisticated instrumentation. And we all became experts on measuring thrust and accelerations and developing techniques to demonstrate maximum performance. And we cut our teeth on this. We ran hundreds of tests to refine each portion of the airplane flight path. And then along came Ed. And he had this dumb idea that the noise an aircraft makes would govern its performance in the future. And here was this guy lecturing the experts on how to measure performance. And he's saying, forget all that. Forget the VMUs and the thrusts and the RTOs. Concentrate on things like EPNDB. And he said the obscure science of noise measurements was of equal importance to the aircraft's success, and we better suit up with people, equipment, and techniques, or we'd be hurting. Well, in his way, he lectured us on this for a year, and we finally gave in. And we spent the money on microphones and filters and bearded scientists, and he was right. Then he did a lot of struggling with new equipment and new people and new techniques and arguing with engineering on the difference between perfection and practicality. Arguing with the FAA on data validation, and continually arguing with us aircraft performance people for another test or another condition or another location to run his test. And today, this is history, as Dick says, that sound level testing is an accepted requirement for aircraft testing. So, Ed, I want to thank you for some of my gray hairs and some of my lack of hairs, for some interesting lectures, and for your contribution to the industry.
Okay, our next speaker comes from outside the testing department, but he has an intimate association with Ed through the subject Bill was just talking about, noise testing. I'd like to have Bob Penley step up here, who is currently the Director of Industry and Regulatory Affairs for Douglas.
How about a sound level check here? Cliff, is this about a 55 dBA level over there at your table? I first met Ed Zweiback when I was assigned back in 1969 to managing our noise reduction technology programs. And one of the first steps I undertook was to meet with the acoustics engineering people and get them to bring me aboard, tell me about the lay of the land, and so on. And they took me through what they thought we were going to have to do to get these airplanes quieted. And they told me about these weird materials they had in mind for applying to the inner surfaces of the fan ducts, which hopefully would absorb some of the fan noise before it escaped from the nacelle out into the communities near airports. They told me about daisy nozzles, which you could put on the back end of jets and somehow would make a whole bunch of small jets make less noise than one big jet, which turned out to be true except in the high frequencies to which the ear is most sensitive. They told me about all these things, and then they said, now, we'll need to get you set up with a meeting with Ed Zweiback. And I said, Zweiback? Who's Zweiback? So, well, he's the guy that has the people who have put together this elaborate system of measuring flyover noise. They have instrumentation up in the airplane. They have instrumentation of various sorts on the ground. They shoot lasers up there to keep record on just where the airplane is, somehow doesn't blind the pilots. And they have a big van down here where they record all these signals on magnetic tapes. Then they take those magnetic tapes and they put them into a big thing he's got out there in Building 41, which is 8 feet high and 10 feet wide, full of black boxes. And out of that comes dBs, on which the company's future hangs. And how does the company's future hang on this? Well, on one hand, we've got the regulators driving down the maximum noise levels that we're allowed to demonstrate in these airplanes And on the other hand, we've got these demands from the airlines to jack the weights of the airplane up in terms of passengers and fuel and powerful engines to keep the noise up high, and in between is Zweiback. Zweiback. Ought to be easy to find a telephone directory. I remembered from my German, Zweiback. That means twice baked, doesn't it? And that turned out to be kind of an apt description. I never found him going off, never went off half-baked. They said, now another thing you will find out about Zweiback is he is a straight arrow. And I said, straight arrow, that's right. I found out that was true. He was a straight arrow, but also with a sharp point. Stiff feathers, too. And so began my exposure in working with Ed and this strange culture he was mixed up with. My exposure to a bunch of bizarre people responding in a bizarre manner to bizarre circumstances. First one, we got the inside of a DC-8 nacelles all plastered up with this strange material that the acoustics people said was going to absorb fan noise to some extent. And first of all, we had to take the DC-8, rent it from Seaboard Airlines, and put the thing in the air up at Fresno over Ed's microphones and get all these tapes and run them through the machines, get the dBs, and see what the noise level was before we made this installation that acoustics said would quiet the airplane. And Bob Butler was in charge of the operations at that time, as I remember. Took his airplane up to Fresno and had the microphones all set out in the vineyards and flew the airplane over the repeated number of flights, and came back and told me that the newspapers had reported the noise testing that Douglas had conducted on their DC-8, and he got several calls commenting favorably how quiet the noise of the airplane was. Then later, we put in the materials that are going to quiet the airplane down and went back for the second test to see if we, in fact, could demonstrate on Ed's machinery that the thing was quieter. And by George, it really was. You could actually tell that. And we were very proud of it. And the tests with the treated airplane took place on a Sunday morning with this irascible NASA program monitor that we had to contend with, watching over everything. John, and I was standing out there witnessing some of my first tests of the field, of what Ed's people did, and the DC-8 made 2 or 3 runs past on approach, which was a critical problem in noise that we were trying to attenuate. And I looked across this road, and there was this lovely little house over there with a young family out there on Sunday morning working away in their flowers on their shrubs and lawns. And I thought, I'll go over and see how these people feel about this airplane now that they must have known is flying by and quieter. And I said, introduced myself, I'm with Douglas Aircraft, and I guess you've read in the paper about our noise test. Yes, they had. I said, what'd you think about the airplane? And they said, well, we hadn't noticed. It was gone by 3 times. No, they hadn't noticed. And I said, well, it'll be coming by again. Take good notice of how much quieter it is. So we had a little disappointment there. These people hadn't apparently, while working on their flowers on their lawn, really sensed these dB increments that Ed's machinery told us was really there. Well, then the next thing that happened, I was confronted, along with Ed, with the job of trying to get our DC-9s with these gigantic weights that we had to offer to be able to sell the airplane past the government microphones in the certification test, meet these stringent noise limits with these high weights. Looking through the government's book on how to make tests, it said you can't have any thick or heavily matted grass below the microphone. Is that what it says? So that told me that thick and heavily matted grass was a good thing if you could get it underneath the microphone, but we can't make it too thick or too heavy. We're going to go down to Yuma, they tell me, and how much grass is there at Yuma? Well, there isn't any. So I said, well, get some trucks and go over to a nursery, that's the word, and get some grass and transport it over there and send the bill to Wendell Way for the grass and plant it beneath the microphones. Be sure it's not too heavy or too matted. We had a little trouble with the farmer planting Bermuda grass amongst his crops. But then the funny thing was, Wendell Way called me a few days later, and he wanted to have more details from me on this pot party in Yuma that he had a bill for providing the grass for. They took me up to Modesto, where we were going to make some more tests. Getting too dry at Yuma, and we kept getting chased further and further north, where there are more water molecules. It's supposed to do better things for the testing. And they stashed me for a moment out there on a beautiful farm field in the early morning, gorgeous morning. I remember standing there looking out on this beautiful crop, and I heard this airplane coming, and it was obviously not our test airplane. It was a open cockpit biplane coming along very low, coming right at us. I thought, gee, look at that. Look at this guy out there, looking like, making like the Red Baron in his open cockpit biplane. Isn't that great? I wish I was up there. And he came right over.